Right, good morning everyone. Thank you for having me here. My name is Tittle. I'm with the Sustainable Economies Law Center based in Oakland, California. And as was mentioned, my colleague Yassir Kandari, who was scheduled to be here, is unfortunately dealing with some family issues. So I will do my, my best impression of her. So just a brief word about the work that we do at the Sustainable Economies Law Center. We provide 4 essential legal tools to help communities transition to more just and resilient local economies. And policy recommendations, specifically, that's right, you guys are going to just come around. That's right. If you don't mind staring at a blue screen, I think we can probably get through it. Anyways, we have a program that focuses specifically on creating policies for cities to support local economies. So that's what I'm going to be sharing a little bit about today. Some brief context about the Bay Area, because that really informs the policy work that we do, although we do have a national focus. You've already heard a little bit about the Bay Area's role in the sharing economy. In a lot of ways, it is the epicenter of the sharing economy movement, and in particular, the tech-driven sharing economy. It is a home to a number of tech startups, dozens of them, not just the big 3, Airbnb, Lyft, and Uber. There's almost every day, it seems like there's another tech-driven startup that's popping up out of the Bay Area. But it's also an area with some of the highest income inequality in the nation. In Oakland, where I live, it's a city that's rapidly being recreated, and the benefits are not being necessarily distributed equally. Just as an example, sort of a proxy measure of this, the African American population of Oakland has dropped from over 40% of the population to under 25% in the last decade. You know, this is obviously due to a lot of really complex factors, but one of which, of course, is tech-driven economic boom that is disproportionately benefiting certain sectors of our communities. So our policies reflect the context of the Bay Area to a certain degree, although what I'm sharing I think should be broadly relevant to cities of all shapes and sizes. So today I'm going to start with a kind of like zoom out, like what is the sharing economy? We've talked about some very specific players within the sharing economy, but I'm going to maybe focus on a broader context of what else is happening in the sharing economy. And then I'll focus very specifically on some policy recommendations that we are still drafting to specifically deal with short-term rentals, Airbnb-style rentals. And the leadership of Portland, I think, is a great place to start looking at that. So, you know, what is the sharing economy? Maybe a quick poll. How many folks here or cities are actively thinking about how or if to regulate the sharing economy? All right. Or already have. That's a great. How many have already taken proactive steps to regulate? Much smaller number. Good. So this is a relevant topic. So what is the sharing economy? Or more precisely, what is unique about it? Because in reality, sharing has formed the basis of human economic activity for millennia, right? This is not a new idea, the concept of sharing. But what is perhaps unique in this moment is the intersection of new technology, but also economic instability, and a sort of re-emerging culture of peer-to-peer relationships. And I think these 3 factors are kind of coming together at this moment to create some really interesting, novel, but also potentially problematic dynamics in our communities. So what are some other examples of this sort of non-tech sharing economy? We heard about, you know, tool lending libraries and tiny, what do you call them?
Community gardens.
Well, there's community gardens, but the little book sharing. Little free libraries, yeah, there's a couple in my neighborhood and they're awesome. Although some of them kind of smell strange. But what else is going on, or has been happening for a while? Right, credit unions, these are a form of shared finance and capital. Worker-owned businesses are a form of sharing labor. Housing cooperatives, which have been around for decades, are forms of shared housing. Co-working spaces are another really hot thing that is popping up all over the Bay Area and around the country. Urban farms and community gardens. Time banking, which are sort of mutual support networks where people trade services by valuing each other's time equally. So there's a lot of pretty unique economic practices that communities have been implementing for a long time, a lot of which has come under the radar of regulation, for better or worse. But we're finally getting to the point where it is in cities' interest to start figuring out how best to support the types of sharing projects that we actually want to see. I think another important point is that the sharing economy in general has challenged some core 20th century assumptions about our planning and regulatory frameworks. Namely, the idea that residential, commercial, industrial, and agricultural activities should all be done in completely separate areas, and that single-family homes operate as independent economic units. This is not necessarily very true anymore, and yet our regulatory frameworks often still assume that is the case. So, all that said, there's a few of these big so-called sharing economy companies. We've got a lot of media attention and have probably put a lot of pressure on the city, as we've heard, phone calls and meetings and such. But the cumulative impacts of some of these companies' activities is still rather ambivalent on lives and livelihoods. So, for example, what are the externalities of these sharing economy companies? One claim that they make is that they reduce emissions. Yet, at least one study recently found that for the majority of car-sharing users, the number of trips actually went up because of more convenient access to cars. Similarly, a study done by a Harvard researcher named Juliet Shore, who's on a 6-year research project to look at the impacts of the sharing economy, found that Airbnb users are taking more trips because of the access to platforms like Airbnb. So on the whole, the ecological impacts of the sharing economy are still up in the air. Likewise, the claim that sharing builds social capital is somewhat ambiguous in these large tech-driven platforms. Shore's team did some research at a local food swap where people exchange fruit and vegetables that they grew, and they found a type of class privilege working, that some people were only willing to make exchanges with people of a similar social or educational background. So there's concern that these types of platforms may actually be reinforcing already embedded racial, cultural, gender biases because of the way that these people interact. Likewise, labor. I mean, the classic example is the impact on taxi drivers when Uber and Lyft come into a city. It's definitely too early to say conclusively what the overall impact of these types of projects will be on labor, since across the whole economy, labor conditions are down. Wage as a total proportion of national income is almost at historic lows. So we don't want to say that it's because of the sharing economy exclusively, but what are the ways that it is contributing to that? So city governments clearly have a role to facilitate specific aspects of the sharing economy that meet the needs of each particular city. And cities can do this by designing infrastructure, services, incentives, regulations that factor in the social exchanges taking place.
The presentation is here, if you want to go on your device.
Awesome. Oh, yeah, there you go. Follow along. So to help us navigate all the complexities that are wrapped up in this, rather disruptive moment of technology and new forms of business generation, we at the Sustainable Economies Law Center have started drafting a set of principles for a true sharing economy. That's what we're calling it. And these principles they're still in a draft form, but I can make them available to you. But our goal is to sort of define a set of best practices that could be useful for both entrepreneurs who are designing these types of new business structures, but also for other stakeholders, including city leaders, to sort of gauge on a spectrum where different projects are falling. Is it actually meeting the needs of your city, or are you just being pressured by larger dynamics in the economy? As with all kind of regulations and policy, it's about finding the right balance between conflicting interests. So I guess I'll just share all these very briefly, these principles, even though you won't be able to see them. I'll just go through them real quickly, the 6, and then I can kind of go into them more detail either right now or in the question and answer what we mean by them. But we think that a true sharing economy should also include shared wealth and prosperity, right? That true sharing economies fairly distribute wealth to the people who are actually creating the value and generate inclusive prosperity for all members of a community, not just those who happen to have access to a particular form of technology. So worker cooperatives are a really good example that we promote at the Sustainable Economies Law Center as a form of sharing that is fundamentally about the equitable distribution of value. We also think that a true sharing economy should share capitalization and risk. At the moment, these big sharing economy companies are heavily capitalized by a very small number of investors, shareholders, who are reaping great benefits from it. And yet, the value that is being distributed to the actual users of the platforms is not necessarily equitably distributed. So we're interested in developing new forms of crowdfunding, democratizing the finance of projects so that all communities can create the types of platforms that meet their needs, not just those in Silicon Valley. We also think a true sharing economy should share power in decision making. And I think this is a really big one. So sharing economy projects should have or could have democratic or at least highly participatory governance structures. My colleague and the executive director of the Sustainable Economies Law Center, Janelle Orsi, has written a blog article about this, suggesting that Airbnb and such platforms should be cooperatives. They should be owned by the users of the platforms, since the users are the ones that are actually generating the value that is actually, at the moment, trickling up to the shareholders. So, that's a claim that sparked a lot of conversation, and it's one I'd love to continue if people here are interested in that. But that's just one example of a way that an organization or a project could be more participatory, more democratic, and more equitably distribute decision-making about the activities of a company. We also think that a true sharing economy should share resources and efforts. I mean, that is the classic claim of the sharing economy, that it's more efficiently using resources. But as we went through, the evidence is not necessarily there to support this claim just yet. I think most importantly, in this context, sharing economy projects should not create artificial scarcities, which is potentially what's happening with Airbnb and such platforms in cities that have really tight housing markets already. And this is an issue I'll come back to and go into a bit more detail. We also think a sharing economy should be about sharing knowledge and information, that the data captured by these big platforms should be distributed both to the users so they understand what's going on in their communities, but to city leaders who actually need this information to create reasonable regulation. So knowledge, it should be shared, it should not be sold. And companies should be transparent, and they should be accountable to all the stakeholders that their activities are impacting. And finally, we think a true sharing economy is about sharing responsibility for the common good, right? These projects ultimately should be about combating inequality and discrimination rather than reinforcing it. Ideally, they're incentivizing socially responsible behavior, and perhaps they're even designed with future generations in mind. They're not just about short-term returns, right? It's about actually improving the resilience of the communities that they operate in. So those are our draft principles. We would love feedback on them, and in fact, particularly feedback on how we could make a set of principles like this immediately relevant to city leaders. At the moment, as you've probably heard, they're kind of geared towards entrepreneurs or community members, but we think they could have application for policy. So this is something we're still working on. And speaking of policy, the Sustainable Economies Law Center has actually published several policy briefs that are directly relevant to this conversation. One is called Policies for Shareable Cities, a primer for urban leaders. And this was co-published in 2013 with shareable.net. I believe that was already shared with most of you, but I can make sure that gets in your hands. It details 32 different policies that could be implemented right now, and in fact are being implemented in cities across the country. Policies that help cities enable shared transportation, local food economies, shared housing, and livelihoods, job creation in the sharing economy. And one more policy brief that I'll actually go into more detail right now that we're still working on is a specific brief around how cities can regulate short-term rentals. Because this is seemingly the issue that a lot of cities are having to act on rather quickly. So historically, cities have played a major role in shaping America's housing landscape. Cities protect access to affordable housing through planning, inclusionary zoning, rent control, other policy mechanisms. And cities also manage the long-term vitality of neighborhoods through zoning policies, nuisance laws, public works. So cities obviously have a very large role to play in shaping the long-term change of neighborhoods. So when companies like Airbnb, or in fact just new business models in general, come into play, I think it's incumbent on cities to be able to respond in a way that protects the interests of the stakeholders that your city is interested in protecting, and protects against the types of exploitative economic relationships that might be created without regulation. So we're going to focus a little bit in more detail on the short-term rental policy brief that we are creating. So we recognize, of course, that each city should regulate short-term rentals according to its own unique circumstances and priorities. So the draft that we've created is basically just a guideline for how cities might do it. And it goes through a number of factors that each city will want to weigh, rather than a prescriptive, this is how you should do it approach. As Portland is really modeled, I think stakeholder engagement in crafting such regulations is really important. We need to understand what are the different stakeholder interests and what are people actually concerned about. Ideally, cities can craft equitable policies that protect basic public interests like housing affordability, neighborhood stability, health and safety, municipal revenues, etc., while also retaining the ability for certain people within the community to generate, more income and opportunities to supplement their existing incomes. So we basically have five factors that cities might want to include in a regulation of short-term rentals. One we think that's really basic but important is a clear definition of what a short-term rental is. We have come up with three different subcategories of short-term rentals that are useful to think about. One is a hosted primary residence short-term rental, one in which the host actually lives in the unit that's being rented and is there when the guest is staying. And you can define a primary residence in different ways, but one basic way is that they live in that unit for at least 9 months out of a year. So a hosted primary residence short-term rental is one where the host is actually there, right? An unhosted primary residence short-term rental is still a unit that is the primary residence, but let's say the host has gone away for the weekend and they've made that space available to guests. And the third category are vacation rentals. These are the ones where it's a second or a third or a fourth home for someone, or even a company that's purchased an entire apartment building or a home and is just using it to generate money for themselves by renting it through one of these platforms. And so the way you would regulate each one of these three might actually be different. A second aspect of a short-term rental policy you might want to include, again, it may seem obvious, but you want to require simple registration and record-keeping process. We think the registration fees should probably be low, but again, you're going to need to balance the costs of actually enforcing and administering this process versus how high you want to set it. But a simple collection of basic information will really aid in enforcing policies down the line. And it establishes a relationship between a city official and a host, which may be important. There could also be a renewal process. Some cities like Anaheim in California require the registration to be renewed every year. Some cities, I think Portland, require it every 2 years. And some places like Maui require a sort of combination, that it's a yearly renewal, but if you've received complaints, it's every 2 years you have to renew unless you've received a complaint, and then it has to happen more frequently. So it's sort of a performance-based process. A short-term rental policy will want to ensure the well-being of guests, right, by ensuring basic health and safety, compliance, insurance of the hosts, perhaps a graduated set of sanctions for people who do receive complaints or violate the ordinance. You want to establish an oversight procedure, right? So how do you actually act on complaints when they're received? And the last part, which is perhaps the most nuanced part of our policy recommendation, is we recommend that cities establish a system for setting caps, either on the number of nights that a unit can be rented per year, and or on the annual income that can be generated by a short-term rental. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail. Depending on the priorities of the city, you may want to set different caps on hosted versus unhosted primary residence STRs, because they have different impacts on the city. For example, hosted residents, units are probably going to be people who are just supplementing their income, but they still live in the city, they still work in that city perhaps. Whereas an unhosted residence, it may actually be creating a larger proportion of someone's income, and therefore it might be driving up the cost of housing in that area by making that unit more valuable on the market. Right? The ability to derive income from a housing unit raises its value, so it raises the prevailing housing prices for the entire market. And this is why we think cities may want to actually put a very strict cap or outright ban on vacation rentals for short-term rentals. And again, this will depend on the specific priorities of your city. But in a place like San Francisco, where we have an extremely tight housing market, there's an affordability crisis happening. The idea that individuals or companies are actually buying homes, taking them off the rental market to rent to short-term guests is actually very problematic for a number of reasons. Some of you may have heard San Francisco did in fact just pass a short-term rental policy that goes into effect in just a couple weeks, I believe, February. And they did some really interesting things. I'm not necessarily going to pass judgment on whether it's good or bad, but what they did is put a limit of 90 days, 90 nights of rentals on unhosted primary residence short-term rentals. They didn't put a cap on the hosted rentals. So they chose to regulate one of these three. And we'll see what the impacts of that might be. Did I get that right? Yeah. And just another point, to cap unhosted short-term rentals ensures that units don't go off the market completely, right? Because that's really what you want to protect against, is that people are actually taking units off the rental market and therefore creating an artificial scarcity and therefore raising the overall cost of housing in the city. Since my time is running out, I'll just say our most interesting aspect of the regulation, of our policy recommendation, is that we think where possible, cities could actually regulate or set these caps on a unit-by-unit basis. Instead of saying that everyone has the same caps, you could actually say that some communities who actually need more income generation to supplement their cost of living could actually rent out their units more nights per year. And in units or neighborhoods that are already well off and don't need this to supplement their cost of living just to be able to get by, you could lower that cap. So this would be probably the most responsive form of regulation you could do, is actually on a unit-by-unit basis say, this is how many nights per year you can rent out your home. And you could design a process for applying for, to raise that cap or to lower it, and depending on how much data you might have as a city, you could really use this to tailor the impacts of short-term rentals on the city as a whole. Great. And with all that said, I'm really excited that this group of people exists, that you're having these conversations. I think cities really are taking a leadership role in shaping the way the sharing economy impacts the economy as a whole. And it remains to be seen whether the sharing economy is just business as usual or something that's actually transformative. We're working to support you all in making decisions that do support community resilience and more localized economies. Hopefully my contact information will be available, and we really do welcome feedback and questions, and we want to be able to support you. So thank you very much, and I welcome the conversation.